The night meant to celebrate 40 years of marriage was the same night I realized my life could have ended with a single careless sip. The room was full of laughter, the kind that comes easily when people believe they are safe, when they believe nothing truly bad can happen in a place decorated with white flowers and soft music. I stood there with a champagne glass in my hand, listening to the hum of familiar voices, when I saw my daughter-in-law's fingers hover just a second too long over my drink. Something small fell. Something deliberate. She smiled immediately, after the smile of someone convinced the hardest part was already over. I didn't shout. I didn't reach for her wrist or knock the glass away. I didn't warn my wife standing inches from me, radiant and unsuspecting. I said nothing at all. I watched the bubbles rise through the pale gold liquid and understood with terrifying clarity that this was not an accident or a moment of desperation. This was a plan. I stayed silent because silence that night was safer than the truth. I stayed silent because I already knew that the glass in my hand would not be the one I drank from. And I stayed silent because what was about to happen would expose far more than a single act of betrayal. It would reveal who in that room believed my age made me weak and how dangerously wrong they were. The ballroom was warm, crowded with faces I had known for decades. Former colleagues from the hospital, neighbors who had watched our children grow up. Friends who remembered us when our hair was darker and our worries were smaller. 40 years of marriage deserved celebration, and my wife deserved every smile she received that night. I kept my posture relaxed, my expression calm, even as my heart slowed into the steady rhythm I knew so well from years in the operating room. Panic had never saved a patient. It wouldn't save me now. As people took their seats and the music softened, servers moved through the room with trays of champagne. Glasses clinked, fabric brushed against fabric, and the low murmur of anticipation settled into something almost ceremonial. I had performed thousands of procedures in my life, and I recognized the feeling instantly. That quiet before a decisive moment. That stillness where everything balanced on a single action. I glanced again at my daughter-in-law. She stood close to my son, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her body language effortless, affectionate, convincing. Anyone watching would have seen a devoted wife, a caring presence in the family. No one would have noticed the calculation behind her eyes. No one except me. When you spend decades as a surgeon, you learn to notice what others dismiss. A tremor that doesn't belong, a hesitation that signals something is wrong. Her movement had been precise, practiced. This wasn't fear, it wasn't impulse, it was confidence. The toast was announced. A few people tapped their glasses, gently smiling toward the front of the room. I felt my wife's shoulder brush against mine, familiar and grounding. She squeezed my hand, her fingers warm, trusting. That trust weighed heavier than any fear I felt for myself. In that moment, I understood something with brutal clarity. If I spoke, if I exposed the act right there, I might save myself, but I would destroy her sense of safety forever. Chaos would erupt, accusations would fly, and the truth tangled in shock and denial might never fully surface. Silence, on the other hand, would give the truth room to breathe. I excused myself with a soft smile, a gesture no one questioned. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if taking in the room, exchanging quiet greetings. My path took me close to the table where unused glasses rested, where a second champagne flute sat untouched. The movement was small, unremarkable. A shift of position, a brief pause, a hand lowering one glass and lifting another. By the time I returned to my place beside my wife, no one noticed anything different. That was the point. I held the glass loosely, the cool stem steady between my fingers, and met my daughter-in-law's eyes. Her gaze flicked to my hand, then away, satisfied. She believed the outcome was sealed. As the room rose to its feet, I listened to words spoken about love and endurance, about partnership and time. They were kind words, sincere words, and they deserved to be honored. I raised my glass with everyone else, my arm steady, my face composed. If anyone was watching me closely, they saw nothing out of place. But inside, everything had changed. This moment did not come out of nowhere. It wasn't born in a single night or a single decision. It was the result of months of small shifts, quiet pressures, and concerns disguised as care. To understand how I stood there, so calm with a poisoned glass, meant for me, you have to understand the life I believed I had earned and the subtle way it began to slip out of my hands. For 35 years, I worked as a surgeon. I lived in a world where precision mattered, where mistakes were immediate and unforgiving. I learned early that discipline saves lives. Emotion clouds judgment. Preparation determines outcomes. When I finally retired, I believed I was stepping away from danger, not into a different kind of it. I had imagined my later years as a reward for decades of responsibility. Quiet mornings, long conversations with my wife, family dinners that felt uncomplicated. I believed stability was protection. I believed that respect earned over a lifetime insulated me from harm. I was wrong. My wife and I had been together for more than 4 decades. We built a life on routines that felt unbreakable. Morning coffee at the same time every day. Walks taken slowly, hand in hand. Decisions made together always. She was my anchor, the one constant through years of exhaustion and triumph. Protecting her had always been instinctive. That night, it became my highest priority. Our son had changed after he married. Not dramatically, not in ways that demanded confrontation, just enough to be dismissed as adulthood, as distance created by a new family. He deferred to his wife more often. He spoke less when decisions were discussed. I noticed, but I told myself it was natural. Parents are supposed to step back. That's what I believed. Family gatherings became more structured, less spontaneous. Conversations shifted toward planning, toward what the future required, rather than what the present allowed. Questions about my health appeared casually, then regularly. Comments about memory, about fatigue, about being careful. None of it sounded cruel. All of it sounded reasonable. That was the most dangerous part. Concern is the easiest mask to wear. Control slips in quietly when it's wrapped in kindness. By the time you recognize it, you've already adjusted your behavior to accommodate it. Standing there with the glass raised, I thought about how easily I had underestimated the situation. Not because I lacked intelligence or experience, but because I trusted the wrong context. I believed family meant safety. I believed love made harm unlikely. The toast concluded. Voices rose together, a unified sound of celebration. I brought the glass to my lips, my movement unhurried. For a fraction of a second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then I drank. The champagne tasted exactly as it should. Crisp, familiar. I lowered the glass and felt nothing but the steady presence of my own body, unaltered, clear. My gaze shifted immediately, not to myself, but across the room. Because from that moment on, what mattered was not what I felt. It was what was about to happen to the person who believed she had already won. And that finally was when I knew the truth would no longer stay hidden. I need to step back from that raised glass for a moment. Because to understand why I stood so calmly with poison meant for me, you have to understand the life I believed I had already survived. That night didn't begin the betrayal. It only confirmed it. For most of my adult life, I lived inside operating rooms. 35 years as a surgeon teaches you certain habits that never quite leave your body. You learn to control your breathing before your hands ever move. You learn to slow your thoughts when everything around you is urgent. You learn that panic is contagious and calm is authority. I carried those habits home with me every night, even after I hung up my scrubs for the last time. When I retired, I told myself I had earned peace. I had spent decades standing between life and death, making decisions that could never be undone. I had watched families break down in hallways and watched others cling to hope with everything they had. I believed that once I stepped away from that world, danger would step away from me too. I believed my life would finally shrink to manageable, gentle concerns. There was pride in that belief. Pride in having endured, in having provided, in having reached an age where survival itself felt like an accomplishment. I had done my part. That's what I told myself. The rest was supposed to be simple. My marriage was the one thing in my life that had never felt uncertain. My wife and I had been together for more than 40 years, long enough to know each other's silences as well as our words. We had grown older, side by side, adjusting to slower mornings and quieter evenings, without resentment. She had stood beside me through nights when I came home exhausted and distant, still carrying the weight of other people's emergencies. If there was one thing I trusted without question, it was her presence. We had routines that anchored us. Coffee at the kitchen table before the sun fully rose. A shared glance when something on the news felt absurd. Walks that took longer than they used to but felt more meaningful because of it. I assumed those routines were unbreakable because they were built on loyalty, not convenience. Looking back now, I understand how much I took that stability for granted. When something lasts long enough, you stop imagining it could end. You stop protecting it the way you once did. Our son was the center of many of those routines, especially after he grew older. I remember the version of him who once ran through our house without thinking, who asked questions, without fear of sounding foolish. I remember the pride I felt watching him build his own life, believing that distance was simply part of that process. Parents are supposed to fade into the background. That's what everyone tells you. When he married, I told myself the changes were natural. He called less often, he deferred more. He looked to his wife before answering questions he used to answer confidently on his own. None of it felt alarming in isolation. I dismissed the small shifts because they fit a familiar narrative. A man starts his own family. His priorities change. That's life. The truth is, manipulation rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as adjustment. It hides behind words like compromise and maturity. And when you're older, when you've lived through enough upheaval, you're more inclined to welcome anything that feels like peace. Family gatherings began to feel different, though I couldn't have explained how at first. They were still polite, still warm on the surface, but something underneath had become structured, almost rehearsed. Conversations drifted in predictable directions. Topics returned again and again, as if guided by an invisible hand. My health came up more often than it used to. Not dramatically, just enough to feel thoughtful. How was I sleeping? Was I feeling tired? Had I noticed any trouble concentrating? It was framed as concern, as care. Who questions concern from family? I answered honestly. Yes, I got tired sometimes. Yes, I misplaced my glasses occasionally. I was 70 years old, not immune to time, but every answer seemed to linger in the room longer than necessary, as if it were being filed away rather than acknowledged. What unsettled me most was how easily those questions turned into statements. You've seemed a bit forgetful lately. You've been pushing yourself too hard. You should think about slowing down. They weren't accusations. They were conclusions. At first, I brushed them aside. After all, I had spent years reassuring patients that aging didn't mean immediate decline. I believed that about myself, too. I had always trusted my own mind. I had trusted my judgment under pressure more than anything else in my life. That trust became a liability. I didn't notice when my wife was gently excluded from certain conversations. I didn't question why appointments and plans were discussed around me instead of with me. I assumed people were trying to help. I assumed family would never confuse control with care. The most dangerous assumption I made was that familiarity equals safety. That because these were people who shared my table, my history, my blood, they couldn't possibly wish me harm. I had seen strangers do terrible things under stress, but I had never considered that betrayal could grow slowly inside the comfort of family. Retirement amplified that blind spot. When you step away from a demanding career, the world treats you differently. Your authority becomes optional. Your opinions are listened to politely, then weighed against the preferences of others. I accepted that shift as part of aging, not realizing how easily it could be exploited. I told myself I was adapting, that I was learning to let go. In reality, I was being trained to doubt myself. There is a particular vulnerability that comes with later life, one no one warns you about. It isn't physical weakness. It's the expectation that you should step aside gracefully, that resistance looks unseemly. You're supposed to trust those who say they're acting in your best interest, even when their interest seems increasingly involved. I didn't see the danger because nothing felt urgent. There were no raised voices, no confrontations, just a steady narrowing of space. Decisions made for me, plans discussed without my input, smiles offered as reassurance. Looking back, I recognized the pattern instantly. In medicine, we were trained to spot early signs before conditions became irreversible. The irony wasn't lost on me later. I had missed those signs in my own life because they didn't present as symptoms. They presented as concern. That night at the anniversary party, standing among people who believed they were celebrating something permanent, I understood how wrong I had been. Stability is not protection. Trust without awareness is an invitation. The life I thought I had earned was real, but it was also fragile, built on assumptions that no longer applied. The world had shifted quietly around me, and I had mistaken that shift for peace. As I lowered the champagne glass and let my eyes drift across the room, I realized that the danger I faced didn't come from age or illness. It came from being underestimated, from being seen as someone whose resistance had already been negotiated away. That understanding didn't frighten me. It clarified everything. Because once you know how you're being positioned, you can choose where to stand. And that was the moment I stopped assuming my family gatherings were simply about togetherness and started asking myself a far more dangerous question. When concern replaces conversation, who is really in control? The answer to that question would begin revealing itself sooner than anyone expected. The first thing that changed wasn't what they did, it was how they spoke to me. Concern has a sound to it when it's genuine. It's tentative, respectful, open-ended. What crept into my home over those months sounded different, firmer, more polished, less like a question and more like a suggestion that expected compliance. You should really start writing things down just in case. It might be time to let someone else handle the complicated stuff. We just worry because men your age don't always notice when things slip. They said these things gently always, with a smile, always framed as protection. No one raised their voice. No one accused me outright. That was the brilliance of it. Control doesn't announce itself. It eases in sentence by sentence until you forget when your choices stopped being yours. My daughter-in-law became the loudest voice in those conversations. At first she had been almost invisible, agreeable to a fault. She laughed at the right moments, deferred to me when decisions were discussed, praised my career with what felt like sincere admiration. I had liked her for that. I had trusted her because she never challenged me. That changed slowly enough that I nearly missed it. She began positioning herself as helpful in ways I hadn't asked for, offering to schedule appointments, reminding me of plans I had already remembered, bringing up articles she'd read about cognitive health, about how important it was to stay ahead of decline. She spoke as if we were on the same side fighting an invisible enemy together. But she wasn't fighting anything. She was defining it. I noticed how often she spoke about me instead of to me. At dinner, she would explain my habits to others while I sat there listening. He gets tired earlier these days. He forgets names sometimes. He's always been stubborn about rest. They weren't lies. That was the most unsettling part. They were carefully selected truths, arranged to tell a story I hadn't agreed to. I answered questions calmly when they came. How's your memory been lately? Any trouble focusing? Do you ever lose track of conversations? I answered the way I always had, without defensiveness, without exaggeration. I didn't realize at the time that my answers weren't meant to reassure anyone. They were meant to be stored. You can feel when you're being evaluated even if no one says it outright. The room grows quieter when you speak. Eyes linger a second too long. Small mistakes are noticed, not dismissed. I had lived my life being trusted implicitly. That trust was eroding in front of me, replaced by scrutiny. The first time I truly felt it was during a family gathering, when I misplaced my glasses. They were on the counter where I'd left them, but the moment stretched awkwardly. Someone retrieved them for me before I could move. My daughter-in-law smiled sympathetically and said, "Nah. That's exactly what I mean. No malice, just confirmation." In that instant, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, recognition. In my medical career, there was a phase before diagnosis where observation intensified. Nurses watched more closely. Tests were suggested casually. Charts filled with notes that hadn't been there before. This felt the same. Pre-diagnosis surveillance. A narrative being assembled. I began noticing the way conversations ended when I entered the room. How my wife was gently redirected when she asked questions. How decisions were framed as urgent even when they weren't. It was subtle, effective, and deeply invasive. Paperwork started appearing sooner than it should have. Mentions of wills, medical directives, contingency plans. All framed responsibly. All introduced as if they were long overdue. When I hesitated, no one pushed openly. They simply reminded me that time wasn't something I had an abundance of. That word, time, it was used like a quiet threat. What unsettled me most was how reasonable it all sounded. If I had been watching from the outside, I might have agreed with them. That's the danger of manipulation done well. It mimics responsibility so closely that it becomes difficult to separate the two. I didn't confront anyone, not because I was unsure, but because I was very sure of something else. Confrontation would end the process too early. Whatever they were building required my cooperation, or at least my compliance. If I removed that, the truth would never fully surface. Instead, I observed. I paid attention to who spoke when certain topics arose, who grew impatient with delays, who benefited from decisions being made quickly. I watched my daughter-in-law more closely than she realized. Her concern never wavered, but it sharpened. Her language became more precise. She stopped asking questions and started offering conclusions. I felt a strange mix of anger and sadness during those weeks. Anger at the manipulation, sadness at how easily familiarity had been weaponized. There is a particular kind of betrayal that doesn't hurt because it's loud, but because it's quiet enough to doubt yourself. I asked myself the question no one wants to ask. What if they're right? What if I am missing something? What if this is just age? The question didn't last long. I had spent decades distinguishing between organic decline and external interference. I knew what confusion felt like when it came from exhaustion, stress, or illness. This wasn't that. This was intermittent, situational, triggered. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with resolve. If they believed I was slipping, I would let them believe it a little longer. If they were gathering evidence, I would gather my own. Instinct told me this wasn't about helping me manage my future. It was about controlling it. By the time I accepted that something else had already begun to change, my body. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Fatigue after long evenings, a heaviness behind the eyes. Moments where the world felt slightly off, as if someone had dimmed the lights just a bit. The sensation always passed, usually when I was alone. I didn't say anything. I didn't even write it down yet. I wanted to be certain. One evening after a family dinner, I sat alone in my study and waited. The room swayed gently, then steadied. My thoughts slowed, then cleared. The pattern was unmistakable. Whatever was happening to me was not constant. It came and went with proximity. That was when instinct overtook denial. I had no proof yet, no substance to point to, Just a growing certainty that care had become a cover and concern had been sharpened into a tool. I understood then why the questions had felt rehearsed, why the answers had been remembered so carefully. They weren't worried about me losing control. They were preparing to take it. I slept poorly that night, not from fear, but from calculation. Every variable replayed in my mind, every interaction re-examined. When you finally see the shape of a threat, it's impossible to unsee it. By morning, one thing was clear. I could no longer afford to be passive, but I also couldn't afford to be reckless. Whatever they were giving me, whatever they were planning, my body would tell me before my family ever did. And I intended to listen. My body was the first thing to betray the lie they were building around me. It started with a kind of fatigue I couldn't explain, not the honest tiredness that follows a long day, not the deep weariness that comes with age and settles into your bones slowly. This was different. It arrived abruptly, usually after family gatherings, and it left just as suddenly when I was alone again. The first time I noticed it clearly, I had come home from dinner with my son and his wife feeling heavier than I should have. My limbs felt slow, as if gravity had quietly increased while no one was looking. My thoughts lagged behind my intentions. I sat down in my chair and told myself I was just overtired. Within an hour, the sensation faded. By morning, I felt completely normal. I dismissed it the way people dismiss things they don't want to investigate. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself 70 years of living came with unpredictability. I told myself what everyone tells themselves when something feels wrong but inconvenient. Then it happened again and again. The pattern became impossible to ignore once I allowed myself to look for it. The fatigue didn't follow physical exertion. It didn't appear after poor sleep or emotional stress. It appeared after meals I hadn't prepared myself, after drinks poured by someone else, after evenings where concern had been served generously alongside food. Each time, the same arc. A fog settling behind my eyes, a heaviness in my chest, a sense that my thoughts were slipping just out of reach. And then quietly clarity returning when I was alone, unobserved, unassisted. I had spent decades watching bodies react to substances they didn't recognize. I knew the difference between decline and interference. This wasn't aging. This was exposure. Still admitting that meant accepting something far worse. That someone close to me was doing this on purpose. I didn't accuse. I didn't ask questions. I did what I had always done when the stakes were high. I tested variables. The next time we gathered, I changed nothing outwardly. I smiled. I ate. I drank. I listened. But I paid attention in a way I never had before. I noticed who handled the food, who insisted on refilling my glass, who watched me most closely after I swallowed. The fatigue arrived right on schedule. Later that night, sitting alone, I replayed the evening like a case review. There was no randomness in it, no mystery left to solve, only confirmation waiting to be collected. The following week, I declined a family dinner, claiming I wasn't feeling well. I prepared my own meal instead. That night, I waited. I expected something to happen. Nothing did. My thoughts stayed sharp. My body felt like my own. That was when suspicion hardened into certainty. I didn't need lab results to understand what was happening. The dosage was low, carefully measured. Enough to blur, not enough to incapacitate. Enough to raise questions, not enough to trigger alarms. It was a strategy designed to create doubt, not danger. At least not yet. They weren't trying to kill me. They were trying to redefine me. That realization chilled me more than the idea of poison ever could. Death would have been obvious. This was insidious. This was about constructing a version of me that could be managed, spoken for, overridden. I began to notice how easily the narrative slid into place. A moment of confusion became a story. A pause in conversation became evidence. Fatigue became proof. They didn't need me to collapse. They just needed me to seem unreliable. I thought back to patients I'd seen over the years whose autonomy had been quietly eroded. Elderly men and women whose families spoke over them, for them around them. I had always believed I was immune to that fate because I understood it so well. Understanding it, turns out, doesn't protect you if you assume love guarantees safety. I made a deliberate choice not to confront anyone. Confrontation would force them to adjust. It would make them cautious. Silence would keep them confident. Confidence is dangerous when it goes unchecked. Instead, I began to document. Not obsessively, not emotionally, methodically. Dates, locations, who was present, what I ate, what I drank, how I felt afterward, how long the symptoms lasted, when they disappeared. I didn't write down accusations. I wrote down facts. I also began adjusting small things without announcing them. Switching drinks when no one was watching. Eating less at shared meals. Letting a glass sit untouched longer than expected. Each change told me something new. Each confirmed what I already knew. The fog only came when I allowed it to. There were moments when anger surged unexpectedly, sharp and hot. Anger at the betrayal. Anger at myself for not seeing it sooner. Anger at how casually my autonomy was being discussed by people who claimed to care for me. I didn't let that anger dictate my actions. Anger makes noise. Noise draws attention. What I needed was patience. There was also loneliness, a particular kind that comes from knowing something you can't share. I watched my wife move through our days unaware of what was being done to me, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on my chest. Telling her would have brought relief, but it also would have placed her directly in their path. Her reactions would have been watched, interpreted, used. Protecting her meant carrying the truth alone. I reminded myself that this wasn't about pride. It wasn't about proving I was still capable. It was about survival. About ensuring that whatever story was being written about me could not be completed without my consent. I also recognized my limits. Medical certainty does not equal legal certainty. Suspicion, no matter how well-founded, means nothing without proof that can stand outside your own mind. I had no intention of walking into a confrontation armed only with instinct. There were lines I would not cross alone. Late one night, after another careful review of my notes, I sat in my study and considered who I could trust beyond my family. Someone who understood process. Someone who wouldn't flinch at the implications. Someone who would see this not as drama, but as risk. The name came to me easily. A man I had known for years, long before retirement. Discreet, analytical, unsentimental about family dynamics. I didn't call him yet. Not until I had more to offer than a theory. For now, observation was enough. What unsettled me most during that period wasn't fear of physical harm. It was how close I had come to doubting myself. How easily a few well-placed suggestions and a carefully administered substance could have convinced me that my own mind was failing. That I realized was the real danger. Once you accept someone else's version of your decline, resistance becomes almost impossible. I refused to give them that. From that point forward, every family interaction felt like a test. Not of my strength, but of my restraint. They watched me waiting for confirmation. I watched them waiting for overreach. It didn't take long. The concern grew more urgent. The suggestions more specific. The implication that decisions needed to be made soon became harder to disguise. I could feel the pace accelerating just slightly. Impatience creeping in where patience had once sufficed. They believed they were close. I knew better. By then, the fatigue no longer frightened me. It educated me. It told me exactly when I was being targeted and by whom. It was a warning system they didn't realize they had built for me. I slept better once I accepted the truth, not because the situation was resolved, but because uncertainty had been replaced by clarity. I knew what I was facing. I knew what was being attempted. And I knew with absolute certainty that silence was no longer passivity. It was preparation. If they were testing my weakness, I would test their patience. And when the moment came, I would be ready. I didn't confront anyone after that. Not because I was afraid, and not because I lacked certainty. I didn't confront them because confrontation would have been the worst possible move. When you expose a plan too early, you don't stop it. You force it to evolve. Whatever they were doing relied on my predictability, on my continued participation, on my silence being mistaken for confusion. If I shattered that illusion before I understood the full shape of what they intended, I would lose the only advantage I still had. So I chose not to fight. That decision felt counterintuitive at first. Every instinct in me wanted to correct the narrative forming around my name, to insist on my clarity, to defend the autonomy I felt slipping away. But instinct without strategy is just impulse, and impulse has ruined more lives than malice ever has. I thought like a surgeon again. In surgery, the most dangerous moment is not the incision, it's the rush to make it. Diagnosis comes first. Observation comes before action. If you move too quickly, you don't just risk failure. You create damage you can't undo. I applied that discipline to my own life. I watched more than I spoke. I responded without resistance. I let concern roll past me without deflection. I nodded when suggestions were made. I delayed decisions without refusing them outright. Each small concession fed their confidence, and confidence makes people careless. Age helped me in ways they didn't anticipate. They believed patience was a symptom of decline. In reality, patience was my greatest weapon. The hardest part was protecting my wife without letting her know what I was protecting her from. She sensed that something was off, of course. After decades together, she could read the smallest changes in my posture, my tone. She asked if I was all right more than once. I told her I was tired. I told her I needed time. Those were truths, just not the whole truth. If I told her everything, she would have confronted them immediately. She has never been good at hiding emotion, and I love her for that. But honesty in that moment would have placed her directly in their line of sight. Her reactions would have been scrutinized, interpreted, used as further evidence that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. I couldn't allow that. Carrying the truth alone was a burden I accepted willingly. Love doesn't always look like confession. Sometimes it looks like endurance. I also knew that appearing resistant would accelerate their timeline. If they believed I was slipping away from their influence, they would push harder, faster. Urgency would replace subtlety. That was a risk I wasn't prepared to take yet. So I created a false sense of safety around them. I continued attending family gatherings. I accepted help I didn't need. I allowed conversations about planning to unfold without interruption. On occasion, I even let myself appear mildly forgetful, just enough to align with the version of me they seemed so eager to believe in. It felt degrading at times, performing a weakness I did not possess. But performance, like silence, can be strategic. The more they believed their narrative was working, the more openly they discussed my future in my presence. They spoke about arrangements and contingencies as if my consent were already implied. They spoke with the ease of people who think the outcome is inevitable. Listening to that was painful in ways I hadn't expected. Not because of fear, but because of the casual nature of the betrayal. They weren't whispering in corners. They weren't hiding their assumptions. They believed they had already won. That belief was my opening. I began to notice how often timelines came up. Soon. Before things get complicated. While we still can. The language of inevitability is revealing. People who think time is on their side don't rush. People who fear resistance do. That was when I decided it was time to introduce another variable. One they hadn't accounted for. There are moments in life when you realize instinct alone isn't enough. When you need someone outside the emotional radius of your family, someone who sees risk without sentiment. I knew exactly who that was for me. He was a long-time acquaintance, someone I had known professionally for years. Not a close friend, but a steady one. Analytical, discreet, unimpressed by family drama. He had spent his career navigating legal frameworks where intentions mattered less than evidence and process. I didn't tell him everything at first. I told him just enough. I described the fatigue, the patterns, the conversations that felt rehearsed, the pressure around planning. I framed it as a hypothetical, not an accusation. I watched his reactions carefully. He didn't interrupt. He didn't reassure me prematurely. When I finished, he asked one simple question that confirmed I had been right to call him. "Have you documented any of it?" That was the moment my instincts aligned with strategy. He explained calmly and without drama how easily autonomy can be challenged when doubt is manufactured. How guardianship proceedings don't begin with force, but with suggestion. How narratives once established are difficult to dismantle without clear records. He didn't tell me what to do. He told me what would matter. Documentation, consistency, timing, and most importantly, patience. I left that conversation with no illusions. The situation was more precarious than I had allowed myself to fully acknowledge. But it was also more manageable than they believed. From that point on, I drew boundaries for myself that I would not cross. I would not confront without leverage. I would not react without documentation. I would not allow emotion to dictate exposure. Those rules became my anchor. I stopped guessing and started building a record. I refined my notes. I added context. I cross-referenced dates and interactions. I treated my own life like a case file, not a personal tragedy. There were days when the weight of it all pressed heavily on me. Days when I felt the strain of maintaining composure, of playing a role that diminished me in the eyes of people who once respected me. But each time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of something simple. They believed they were studying my decline. I was documenting their intent. The difference between those two things is the difference between being erased and being exposed. As the weeks passed, I sensed a shift, subtle but unmistakable. Impatience edged into their voices. The concern became more directive. Suggestions turned into expectations. They believed momentum was on their side. They were wrong. What they didn't realize was that silence had bought me time. Time to understand, time to prepare, time to choose the moment when truth would no longer be something I had to argue for. I didn't need to prove I was strong. I only needed to let them show how far they were willing to go. And they were getting closer to doing exactly that. I stopped trusting memory and started trusting paper. Once I committed to silence, as strategy instinct alone was no longer enough. Instinct had warned me, but instinct couldn't protect me if someone else decided to rewrite my story. What I needed was a record that didn't care about feelings, didn't soften edges, and didn't forget. So I turned my own life into documentation. I wrote things down the way I had once written surgical notes. Dates first, locations, who was present, what was served, what was said as closely as I could remember it, without interpretation. Then how I felt afterward, how long it lasted, when it faded. No conclusions, just facts. The pattern sharpened almost immediately. Symptoms appeared only after certain gatherings. Never after meals, I prepared myself. Never after time spent alone or with friends outside the family. The fog didn't arrive randomly. It followed hospitality. I began to notice smaller details that had once felt insignificant. Who poured the drinks? Who insisted I try something new? Who hovered nearby after I took a sip? These moments had always been framed as attentiveness. Now, they read differently. Control rarely announces itself loudly. It prefers proximity. Conversations shifted in subtle ways too. Updates replaced discussions. I was informed rather than consulted. Decisions were summarized for me, not shaped with me. The language was polite, efficient, and deeply revealing. People who believe they already have authority don't bother negotiating. I started paying attention to timing. The urgency around certain topics didn't align with reality. Estate planning that could have waited years was suddenly framed as time-sensitive. Medical evaluations were discussed as if they were inevitable, not optional. Everything pointed toward a timeline that existed only in their minds. That timeline concerned me more than anything else. I reviewed our financial records quietly, the way I'd reviewed charts late at night when something didn't add up. Nothing had been altered yet, but there were suggestions, outlines of future changes, conversations that assumed my agreement long before it had been given. The push wasn't aggressive. It was anticipatory. They were preparing the ground. What unsettled me most was how often decisions were framed as being for my benefit, while clearly benefiting others more. Efficiency was emphasized. Simplification, reducing burden. Those words can be comforting when they're honest. They can also be camouflage. I overheard remarks that were never meant for me, but not carefully enough hidden. Comments about how difficult things might become if we waited too long. How important it was to be ready. The language of inevitability crept in, and with it expectation. That was when I understood something crucial. This wasn't a series of isolated acts. It was a coordinated effort, moving steadily toward a predetermined outcome. Then there was the name. It slipped into conversation casually, almost as an aside. A professional reference. A consultant. Someone who had apparently been mentioned before, though I had no memory of it. The name meant nothing to me, and that was exactly the problem. I didn't ask about it. I wrote it down. In my career, unfamiliar names in patient charts always warranted attention. They signaled expansion, external involvement, a shift from observation to action. I recognized the same warning here. The more I recorded, the clearer the shape of the plan became. The fatigue, the questions, the paperwork, the urgency. None of it stood alone. Together, it formed a narrative designed to establish doubt, then replace autonomy with oversight. And still, I said nothing. Silence at this stage wasn't about patience anymore. It was about letting them reveal themselves fully. People involved in long-term manipulation eventually make mistakes. They repeat phrases, they reuse arguments, they assume understanding where there is none. They also grow bolder. I noticed how my daughter-in-law's tone changed over time. Early concern softened into managerial confidence. She stopped checking whether suggestions were acceptable and started presenting them as conclusions. Her certainty was growing, fed by my lack of resistance. Certainty is intoxicating. It dulls caution. There were moments when doubt crept in, not about what was happening, but about whether I could endure the emotional cost of waiting. Watching people I once trusted speak around me as if I weren't fully present tested my restraint more than any physical symptom ever had. I reminded myself why I was waiting. Confrontation would turn this into a family dispute, a matter of interpretation and denial. Evidence would turn it into something else entirely. Evidence doesn't argue, it speaks. So I allowed one more escalation. I didn't interfere when discussions grew more explicit. I didn't challenge assumptions that bordered on disrespect. I observed who took initiative, who deferred, who benefited from momentum. Patterns solidified. They believed they were tightening the net. What they didn't know was where I intended to stand when it closed. By then, the anniversary had already been mentioned in passing. 40 years, a milestone. A moment that could be framed as sentimental, harmless, celebratory. The idea lodged itself in my mind not as nostalgia, but as opportunity. Public moments change dynamics. Witnesses matter. Memory matters. Reputation matters. I began to see how that night could serve as more than a celebration. It could be a mirror. One that reflected behavior back at those who believed no one was watching. The realization didn't bring satisfaction. It brought resolve. I continued documenting everything. I refined my notes. I backed them up. I cross-referenced timelines until the picture was undeniable. Each entry felt less like self-defense and more like preparation. There was a strange calm that settled over me during that period. Not relief, clarity. Once you understand the shape of a threat, fear loses its grip. You stop reacting and start choosing. They were no longer dealing with a confused old man. They were dealing with someone who had seen plans fail because of impatience, because of overconfidence, because of the assumption that the subject of the plan would remain passive. I wasn't passive. I was waiting. As the weeks passed, the urgency in their voices sharpened. Suggestions became deadlines. Concern became pressure. They were close now, close enough to believe resistance was unlikely. They had underestimated the one thing age had given me in abundance: time. And I was about to use it against them. I was the one who insisted on the anniversary celebration. On the surface, it looked like sentiment. 40 years of marriage is a milestone people expect to be marked, especially when age has a way of making time feel suddenly precious. I framed it as something my wife deserved, a moment to gather the people who had walked beside us through decades of ordinary and extraordinary days. No one questioned that explanation. They smiled, agreed, and leaned into it. That enthusiasm told me everything I needed to know. The idea took hold faster than I anticipated. Suggestions came pouring in almost immediately. Venues, guest lists, menus. My daughter-in-law took particular interest, offering to help coordinate details, eager to reduce what she called the burden on us. I accepted her help without hesitation. The more involved she felt, the more confident she became. Confidence makes people careless. I kept my role intentionally vague. I deferred decisions. I expressed gratitude. I let others believe they were steering the event. In reality, I was watching how quickly control shifted hands when it was presented as assistance. They didn't notice the irony. They were too busy believing they were managing an aging man's final celebration. What they didn't understand was that public moments change the rules. Private manipulation thrives in isolation. It falters under observation. I needed witnesses who knew me well enough to recognize when something didn't add up. Former colleagues who had trusted me with lives. Friends who had seen me think under pressure. People whose memory of me couldn't be overwritten by a few months of quiet suggestion. So I was careful about who was invited. I included those who respected competence, not just familiarity. People who had known me before retirement softened my edges in the eyes of others. People who could say with certainty that I had always been methodical, composed, and precise. Reputation, I had learned, is not vanity. It's protection. The venue mattered too. Neutral ground, well-staffed. Familiar enough to feel safe, public enough to discourage private interference. I didn't announce these considerations. I simply agreed when someone else suggested what I had already chosen. I also paid close attention to timing. The evening was structured deliberately. No long stretches where I could be isolated. No opportunities for quiet pressure disguised as concern. Everything flowed smoothly, predictably. On the surface, it looked like thoughtful planning. Underneath it was containment. The most difficult part was maintaining normalcy at home as the day approached. My wife sensed my tension even when I masked it carefully. She asked if I was nervous about the event. I told her it was just the thought of seeing so many people at once. That was true enough to be believable. There were moments late at night when the weight of what I was doing pressed heavily on me. Using a celebration of our marriage as a strategic stage felt wrong in ways I struggled to articulate. But the alternative was far worse. Allowing the narrative around my decline to solidify unchallenged would eventually erase both of us. I reminded myself of that whenever doubt crept in. As the date drew closer, impatience surfaced in subtle ways. The concern sharpened. Questions about my energy, my sleep, my focus appeared more frequently. Suggestions became reminders. There was a sense of anticipation in the air that had nothing to do with celebration. They believed the evening would resolve something. The night before the anniversary, I slept poorly. Not from fear, but from awareness. I lay beside my wife, listening to her steady breathing, knowing that by the next evening our lives would be permanently altered. Whatever happened there would be no return to comfortable ignorance. I didn't rehearse speeches. I rehearsed silence. I practiced responding without reacting, observing without revealing. I reminded myself that the smallest deviation from expectation could tip them off. Precision mattered now more than ever. By morning, a calm settled over me that surprised even myself. There was clarity in knowing exactly what I was waiting for. Uncertainty had been replaced by intention. The venue buzzed with activity when we arrived that evening. Flowers were arranged, glassware polished, music tested. Everything looked exactly as it should. People greeted us warmly, offering congratulations, recounting memories that made my wife laugh. Watching her that night was both comforting and painful. She was radiant, genuinely happy, unaware of the undercurrent running beneath the celebration. I stayed close to her, not out of fear, but out of purpose. I wanted no doubt, no opportunity for misinterpretation. If something went wrong, I needed to be exactly where I was expected to be. My daughter-in-law moved through the room with practiced ease. She checked details, spoke quietly with staff, accepted compliments on the organization. She looked confident, relaxed. This was not the demeanor of someone worried about being discovered. This was the demeanor of someone certain of the outcome. I noticed how often she glanced in my direction, not anxiously, assessing, measuring. I met her gaze when it happened, offering nothing more than a polite smile. The exchange reassured her more than any words could have. As guests settled in, I felt the shift I had been anticipating. The room reached that collective pause that precedes attention, the moment before speeches, before toasts, before all eyes turned toward the people being honored. It was approaching. Champagne flutes were arranged on a nearby table. Servers moved with practiced efficiency. Laughter softened into murmurs. The atmosphere grew expectant, almost reverent. I felt my heart slow, my breathing steady. This was familiar territory. High stakes, limited margin for error. I stayed exactly where I was meant to be. When the glasses were distributed, I accepted mine without comment. My fingers closed around the stem, cool and smooth. I didn't look at the liquid. I didn't need to. I watched people instead. I watched my son, his expression a mixture of pride and unease. I watched my wife smiling at something someone whispered in her ear. And I watched my daughter-in-law, who stood just close enough to act just far enough to remain unnoticed. Time narrowed, then collapsing into a handful of seconds. I saw her hand move. It was small, efficient, and unmistakable. A practiced motion shielded by bodies and movement. Something dropped. A smile followed. Relief flickered across her face, gone almost before it registered. In that instant, everything I had suspected crystallized into certainty. I felt no surge of panic, no rush of anger, only a quiet acknowledgement that this was exactly where the path I had been walking led. The plan was no longer theoretical. It was in my hand. I said nothing. The choice to remain silent in that moment was not hesitation. It was execution. Speaking would have ended the evening. Silence would allow it to complete itself. I shifted my position slightly, as if adjusting my stance. I stepped closer to the table, then away again. A casual movement. A natural distraction. My hand lowered one glass and lifted another. By the time I returned to my place beside my wife, the room was already focusing forward. No one noticed the exchange. No one questioned it. That too told me everything. I held the new glass lightly and met my daughter-in-law's eyes once more. She looked satisfied, confident, certain she was still in control. The toast was announced. As voices rose and glasses lifted, I understood something with absolute clarity. Whatever happened next would not be decided by family dynamics or private influence. It would unfold in full view, governed by consequence rather than assumption. I raised my glass without hesitation and waited. The room felt different once the glasses were raised. It wasn't quieter, not exactly. The music still played softly, chairs still shifted, and someone laughed a little too loudly near the back. But there was a collective focus now, a narrowing of attention that made everything else feel distant. I had known this moment was coming. Still standing inside it was something else entirely. I held the champagne flute loosely just as I always had, at formal events. No tension in my wrist, no hesitation in my posture. Anyone watching me would have seen a man settled into his place at the center of a celebration, not someone counting heartbeats and watching for signs. The toast began with familiar words: gratitude, longevity, commitment. I let them wash over me without reaction. My eyes moved slowly and deliberately, not toward my wife, not toward the speaker, but across the room, toward her. My daughter-in-law stood with her glass already lifted, her shoulders relaxed, her expression open and warm. She looked exactly as someone should in that moment, proud, supportive, certain. That certainty was what drew my attention. People who believe an outcome is guaranteed stop guarding themselves. I had spent my career watching that moment play out in operating rooms. The instant when a surgeon assumes a complication has passed. When vigilance softens just enough for something to go wrong. Overconfidence isn't loud. It's comfortable. I took a sip. The champagne tasted as it always did. Crisp, slightly dry, familiar enough to register as normal without thought. I swallowed easily and lowered the glass with the rest of the room, adding my voice to the chorus of thanks and applause. My body remained steady, my mind clear. I didn't look at her right away. I didn't need to. I knew where the shift would appear. Seconds passed, then more. I felt nothing. That in itself was confirmation. I turned my attention back across the room and saw her blink just once, a fraction longer than necessary. She shifted her weight subtly, adjusting her stance. At first glance, it looked like nothing. At second glance, it looked like hesitation. I felt a strange stillness settle over me. Not satisfaction, not relief. Focus. She brought her glass down more quickly than before. Her smile stayed in place, but it tightened at the corners. She glanced around, not at me, but at the room, as if orienting herself. The movement was small, easily dismissed. No one else noticed it yet. I did. I had watched the earliest signs of adverse reactions hundreds of times. The body rarely announces distress dramatically at first. It whispers. A moment of imbalance. A pause where there shouldn't be one. A breath taken too shallow, then too deep. She reached for the back of a chair, her fingers brushing it before closing more firmly. Someone beside her leaned in, saying something I couldn't hear. She nodded too quickly, as if reassurance required effort. The celebration continued around her, blissfully unaware. People chatted, glasses clinked again. Someone started a new conversation near the front. I remained exactly where I was, my expression unchanged, my hands relaxed at my sides. Intervening now would have been a mistake. I had learned long ago that outcomes are strongest when they unfold naturally. The moment you rush to explain, you invite doubt. Letting events speak for themselves was the most powerful form of truth. Another few seconds passed. She swayed slightly this time, just enough that someone else noticed. A hand reached out to steady her. Concern rippled quietly, like a disturbance beneath the surface of calm water. Still no panic. Just uncertainty. I watched my son's face tighten as his attention shifted. Confusion crossed his expression, followed by a flicker of alarm. He stepped toward her, asking if she was all right. She opened her mouth to respond and seemed to struggle to find the words. That was when the room truly changed. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. The energy of celebration faltered, replaced by collective awareness that something was wrong. Still, no one shouted. No one screamed. The moment remained contained, balanced on the edge of escalation. She lowered herself into the chair, as if by choice, though the movement lacked grace. Her breathing was uneven now. A sheen of sweat had appeared at her temple. She tried to laugh it off, waving a hand dismissively, but the gesture lacked conviction. I felt no urge to step forward, no need to claim attention. This was not my emergency to manage. Someone suggested getting water. Someone else mentioned calling for medical assistance, their voice low but firm. The staff responded quickly, their training evident. What had been a celebration began transforming into something procedural. I remained still. My wife glanced at me, her brow furrowed with concern. I met her eyes and gave a slight shake of my head, a silent reassurance that I was fine. She searched my face for answers and found none. That too was intentional. Her confusion needed to be genuine. As the situation intensified, I noticed something else. In the midst of her distress, my daughter-in-law looked at me. Not with accusation, not with fear, with recognition. Our eyes met for the briefest moment. In that exchange, something unspoken passed between us. She understood then that the glass had not been meant for her, and that it had not ended up where she intended. The certainty she had worn all evening shattered. I saw it happen in real time. Her gaze flicked away, her breathing quickened, and a new expression surfaced beneath the discomfort. Calculation? She was trying to understand how this had gone wrong. The room filled with quiet urgency. A staff member knelt beside her, asking questions. Another moved to make a call. The words emergency and reaction floated through the air, still subdued but unmistakable. People stepped back, creating space without being asked. I felt a calm settle deeper into my chest. This was no longer a family matter. It was becoming something else entirely. As medical professionals arrived, their presence brought authority with it. They asked clear, direct questions. What had she consumed? When had symptoms begun? Had she taken anything earlier? Their focus narrowed on the facts, stripping emotion from the situation. I listened carefully, not as a participant, but as an observer. The answers came hesitantly, inconsistently. Someone mentioned champagne. Someone else mentioned nothing unusual. No one could explain the timing cleanly. That confusion mattered. The narrative was slipping out of their control. I stood a short distance away, close enough to be present, far enough to avoid attention. People glanced at me, occasionally concern flashing across their faces, but no one questioned my composure. I had been a steady presence all evening. That consistency would matter later. As she was assisted to her feet and guided toward a quieter area, the celebration dissolved entirely. Conversation ceased. Music was turned off. The room exhaled tension, replacing warmth. I caught my wife's hand as she reached for me, her grip tight. I squeezed back gently, grounding us both. She whispered my name, her voice uncertain. I told her softly that we would talk later. Not now. This was not the moment for explanation. As they moved her out of the room, escorted by staff and followed by my son, I felt the final shift take place. What had begun as a private act intended to remain invisible had crossed into public consequence. I didn't follow them. Instead, I stayed where I was, surrounded by witnesses who had seen everything they needed to see. A healthy man. A sudden medical emergency. A celebration interrupted by something no one could easily explain. I knew what questions would come next. And for the first time since this began, I knew I wouldn't have to ask them. The silence I had maintained for months was no longer a shield. It was a stage set for truth. Whatever happened after this would not be shaped by suggestion or concern disguised as care. It would be decided by evidence, procedure, and record. I lifted my abandoned glass from the table, looked at it once more, and set it down untouched. The waiting was over. The toast had ended, but the room never returned to celebration. People stood where they were, glasses half-lowered, voices fading into uneasy murmurs. What should have been applause dissolved into a quiet confusion that spread faster than panic ever could. I remained still, exactly where I had been moments before, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. I took another small sip from my glass, not because I needed to, but because it mattered that I did. Consistency matters when witnesses are forming memories. I swallowed easily, felt nothing unusual, and let my attention drift back across the room. She was no longer trying to smile. My daughter-in-law's face had lost its practiced ease. The warmth she'd worn so confidently had drained away, replaced by something brittle and unfocused. She pressed her lips together, as if concentrating required effort now. One hand rested on the back of the chair again, not casually this time, but with purpose. I watched without expression, counting seconds, the way I used to in surgery. Not because I wanted to see her suffer, but because timing reveals intent. Reactions tell stories that words never can. Someone near her asked if she was all right. She nodded too quickly, then seemed to reconsider. Her balance shifted again, more noticeably this time. The chair scraped softly against the floor as she leaned into it. A few people turned. Conversations nearby stopped mid-sentence. Confusion rippled outward, subtle but unmistakable. The energy of the room had changed, as if an invisible cord had been pulled tight. I did nothing. Intervening too soon would have blurred responsibility. I had learned that long ago. When you rush to help, you take ownership. When you wait, truth has space to surface. She lowered herself into the chair this time without pretending it was a choice. Her breathing had become uneven, shallow in places, too deep in others. A sheen of sweat had spread across her forehead, catching the light. Someone offered her water. She waved it away, then hesitated, as if uncertain. That hesitation was the first thing others noticed. Her words came slower now, her responses less precise. Someone laughed nervously, assuming it was nothing serious. Another voice suggested she might just need air. The instinct to minimize discomfort is powerful in social settings. No one wants to be the one who disrupts the illusion. Except disruption was already underway. I noticed my son step closer to her, concern tightening his features. He asked her something quietly, his voice low and urgent. She answered, but the response seemed to confuse him more than reassure him. His eyes flicked briefly around the room, searching for context, for explanation. They did not find it. The first true interruption came when a staff member approached, kneeling slightly to meet her eyes. The questions were simple, professional. Are you feeling dizzy? Have you eaten? Are you in pain? The room listened without meaning to. I could feel the collective awareness sharpening. This was no longer awkwardness. It was concern with weight behind it. She tried to answer, but her words faltered. That was when the staff member made a decision, glancing toward another employee and giving a subtle nod. A phone appeared in someone's hand. A call was made. I recognized the shift immediately. Procedure had replaced politeness. I remained exactly where I was, my hands relaxed at my sides, my posture unchanged. I had learned long ago that calm is contagious too. In moments like this, people look for anchors. They look for cues on how serious things are. I gave them none. My wife turned towards me, her expression caught between worry and confusion. She reached for my arm, her grip firm. I met her gaze and squeezed her hand gently, just enough to ground her. She searched my face for answers and found only steadiness. That steadiness mattered. As voices lowered and movement slowed, I observed reactions the way I always had when outcomes were uncertain. Who stepped forward? Who hesitated? Who avoided eye contact? Who seemed more concerned with appearances than with the person in distress? Patterns emerged quickly. One detail stood out above the rest. Amid the quiet chaos, my daughter-in-law looked at me again. This time, there was no mistaking the expression. Recognition settled into her eyes, sharp and sudden. In that instant, she understood that something fundamental had gone wrong. The calculation behind her gaze was unmistakable. She wasn't wondering what was happening to her body. She was trying to understand how control had slipped away. Our eyes met briefly, and in that moment the truth passed between us without a word. She knew. I knew she knew. The realization landed hard, and I watched as it unsettled her more than the physical symptoms ever could. Her breathing quickened. Her fingers tightened around the chair. She looked away from me, abruptly scanning the room, as if answers might appear somewhere else. They did not. By the time the medical professionals arrived, the room had gone completely quiet. Music had been turned off. Conversations had stopped. People stood in small clusters, whispering their earlier warmth, replaced by concern and speculation. The professionals moved with efficiency, asking clear questions, checking vitals, assessing her condition. They spoke in measured tones that carried authority. The shift was unmistakable. This was no longer a social situation. It was an incident. I listened carefully, not as someone emotionally involved, but as someone trained to hear what others missed: the timing of symptoms, the lack of prior complaints, the sudden onset. Each detail mattered. Answers came slowly, inconsistently. Someone mentioned champagne. Another mentioned stress. No one could offer a clear explanation that fit all the facts. The professionals exchanged glances, subtle but meaningful. My son hovered nearby, his face pale, his confusion deepening into fear. He looked at his wife, then at the medical staff, then briefly at me. Our eyes met, and something unspoken passed between us too. Doubt. Uncertainty. The first crack in a belief he had never questioned. As they prepared to move her to a quieter area for further evaluation, the room parted instinctively. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. People stepped back without being asked. The gravity of the moment had finally settled in. She was helped to her feet, her movements unsteady, her earlier confidence completely gone. As they guided her away, she glanced back once more. Not at my son, at me. There was something raw in that look now. Not anger, not accusation, fear. And beneath it, understanding. I did not look away. When they left the room, escorted by staff and followed closely by my son, the space they vacated felt enormous. The celebration had been dismantled in minutes. Flowers, glasses, decorations all remained untouched and suddenly out of place. People didn't know what to do with themselves. Some sat, some stood, some whispered. Everyone waited. I stayed where I was. This was important. If I followed, I would become part of the immediate narrative. I would be asked questions too soon, forced into reactions that could be misinterpreted. Distance now was as strategic as silence had been before. My wife leaned toward me, her voice barely audible. She asked if I was all right. I nodded, and for the first time that evening, I told her the truth she could safely hear. I'm fine. It was enough to steady her, though confusion still clouded her eyes. There would be time later for explanations. Not now. The room slowly began to breathe again, but the air had changed. The night would not be remembered for celebration. It would be remembered for interruption. For the moment, something went wrong in a way no one could ignore. That mattered. I glanced once more at the abandoned champagne glasses still resting on the table nearby. They looked identical, innocent, unremarkable. No one could have guessed how much intention had passed through them. I turned away. What happened next would no longer be decided by family conversations or quiet suggestions. It would be guided by protocols, records, and people who asked questions without caring about feelings. The truth had stepped out of the shadows, and from here on, it would move forward without my help. Control left the room the moment uniforms arrived. Not police at first. Medical professionals, calm voices, gloved hands, clipboards, and measured questions that cut through speculation without raising their tone. The shift was immediate and unmistakable. What had been a family gathering moments earlier was now a situation governed by protocol, not emotion. I felt it as clearly as I had ever felt a handoff in an operating room. Once authority changes hands, personal narratives lose their power. They asked her questions first, simple ones. What had she eaten? What had she drunk? When did she begin feeling unwell? Her answers came unevenly, some delayed, some contradictory. She mentioned champagne. She mentioned feeling fine earlier. She mentioned stress exhaustion, anything that might explain what was happening without pointing anywhere specific. I stayed silent. Silence at this point was no longer concealment. It was precision. One of the medical professionals glanced around the room and asked calmly if anyone else had consumed the same drink. A few guests raised their glasses slightly in response, offering confirmation without words. I did the same, lifting my flute just enough to be noticed. No one asked me how I felt. They didn't need to. My posture answered for me. They moved her to a quieter space nearby, away from the crowd. As they did, they continued asking questions, documenting responses, checking vitals. Their focus was narrow and professional. There was no room for family dynamics in the way they worked. Only facts. I watched my son follow them, his expression caught between fear and disbelief. He looked back once, searching the room as if answers might be scattered among the guests. His eyes landed on me briefly. I gave him nothing. Not coldness, not reassurance, just steadiness. It was the first time I saw doubt take hold of him. The room they left behind was subdued, almost stunned. People whispered, speculated, tried to fill the silence with explanations that made them more comfortable. Someone suggested it was an allergic reaction. Someone else mentioned dehydration. A third speculated about anxiety. No one suggested intention. That too mattered. A staff member approached me quietly and asked if I would be willing to answer a few questions when I had a moment. I nodded without hesitation. Cooperation now was not a risk. It was an asset. When the questions came, they were exactly what I expected. What had I consumed that evening? Had I felt any symptoms? Did I have any known medical conditions that could cause sudden reactions? I answered each one plainly, without elaboration, without defensiveness. I didn't volunteer interpretations. I didn't offer theories. I stated facts. I had consumed champagne. I felt fine. I had no history of sudden reactions. The medical professional nodded, writing as I spoke. He didn't look surprised. He looked focused. That focus told me something important. The picture forming in his mind did not align with an accident. As they worked, I could see the procedural gears turning. Blood pressure, heart rate, timing. The rhythm of their questions was familiar to me, even from the other side of the exchange. This wasn't panic response. This was assessment. I didn't feel relief in that moment. Relief suggests escape. What I felt was inevitability. I had spent months preparing for this without knowing exactly how it would unfold. Now that it was unfolding, there was a strange calm in recognizing that nothing I did next would significantly alter the course of events. That power had already transferred. One of the professionals asked if there had been any recent changes in her routine medications or stress levels. Her answers became less certain. She glanced at my son, then away. I noticed the hesitation. So did they. Hesitation is a symptom. At some point, someone asked if there had been any previous incidents. The question hung in the air longer than the others. She shook her head. Too quickly. My son frowned slightly as if something didn't quite fit. I remained where I was answering only when addressed, never stepping forward to insert myself into the process. This wasn't restraint for its own sake. It was trust in the system I knew so well. Medicine doesn't respond to drama. It responds to patterns. As the evaluation continued, the professionals exchanged brief, quiet comments. Not whispers, not secrets, just clinical shorthand, enough to tell me they were aligning observations. Eventually, one of them approached me again. His tone was respectful, neutral. "Sir, you mentioned you're feeling fine. Have you experienced any similar symptoms recently, even if they resolved quickly?" This was the moment preparation mattered. I didn't answer immediately, not for effect, for accuracy. Then I said yes. I explained succinctly that I had experienced intermittent fatigue after family gatherings over the past several months, that the symptoms resolved when I was alone, that I had not previously sought evaluation because they were inconsistent. I watched him carefully as I spoke. He didn't react outwardly, but his pen paused briefly before continuing. That pause was everything. From that point on, the questions shifted. They became more specific, more targeted, less about isolated reaction and more about exposure over time. The tone remained calm, but the direction had changed. They asked about food preparation, about who had access to drinks, about whether anyone else had reported symptoms. I answered honestly, carefully, sticking to what I knew, without speculating. I didn't need to accuse anyone. The pattern was doing that work for me. At some point, the decision was made to escalate. Protocol required it. Reporting obligations were mentioned, not dramatically, just as a matter of course. When certain conditions are met, steps follow automatically. I felt the weight of that decision settle over the room like a quiet verdict. My wife stood close to me now, her confusion deepening into fear. She asked me softly what was happening. I told her the only thing that mattered in that moment. They're taking care of it. It wasn't reassurance. It was truth. As preparations were made to transfer her for further evaluation, the room became a staging area. Staff moved with purpose. Guests were gently directed aside. Conversation stopped entirely. The celebration was over. What replaced it wasn't chaos, but consequence. I stood back as she was escorted away, surrounded by professionals who neither knew nor cared about family roles or intentions. To them, she was a patient. To them, what mattered was cause, not character. I felt no triumph watching her leave. No satisfaction. Only a quiet recognition that the system I trusted was now engaged. That trust was not blind. It was earned. As the room emptied slowly, I remained behind with a handful of staff members and my wife. A few guests approached me, offering concern, asking if I was all right. I thanked them politely. I answered yes. Because I was. Physically, at least. Emotionally, I was somewhere else entirely. What had begun as a private attempt to redefine me had crossed into public record. From this point forward, there would be forms, timelines, questions asked by people who were not invested in preserving anyone's comfort. I had stepped out of the way deliberately. True control, I had learned long ago, is knowing when to release it. As we finally left the venue, my wife's hand tight in mine, I understood something with complete certainty. The truth no longer belonged to me to defend. It belonged to the process. And the process, once started, does not stop for sentiment. The silence afterward was heavier than anything that had come before. Once the questions stopped and the professionals moved on to their reports and procedures, there was nothing left to distract us from what had been broken. The noise of the celebration had vanished completely. No music, no laughter, just the quiet weight of consequences settling into place. Justice, I learned, moves efficiently. Grief does not. My son avoided me in the days that followed. Not out of anger, not openly at least, but out of confusion he didn't know how to face. When we finally spoke, his words came haltingly tangled between disbelief and defense. He asked how I could be so calm. He asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. He asked questions that circled the truth without landing on it. I listened. I answered carefully. Not because I wanted to protect him, but because I no longer wanted to wound him unnecessarily. What I saw in his eyes wasn't malice. It was surrender. The quiet kind that happens when someone lets another person think for them long enough that their own judgment weakens. That realization hurt more than any accusation ever could. I had raised him to be thoughtful, independent, steady. Watching him struggle to reconcile those values with what had unfolded was a grief I hadn't prepared for. Betrayal doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from passivity. That understanding didn't absolve him, but it did explain him. My wife learned the full truth later when the house was quiet and there were no interruptions left to hide behind. I told her everything then, the fatigue, the silence, the preparation, the glass. She listened without speaking at first. Her face pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. When she finally looked at me, the pain in her eyes cut deeper than any fear I had felt for myself. She asked me why I hadn't told her. I told her the truth, that I was afraid her reactions would be used against me, that protecting her meant shielding her from information that could hurt us both, that I believed I could carry it alone. She nodded slowly, but I could see the conflict behind her composure. Love doesn't erase pain. It only gives it context. There were tears later, quiet ones, the kind that come when shock gives way to understanding. We sat together without speaking for a long time, the weight of what had nearly happened pressing down on us both. That night, neither of us slept much. Healing, I would learn, doesn't arrive with resolution. It begins with acknowledgement. The family we once knew was gone, not destroyed in a dramatic explosion, but fractured in ways that couldn't be neatly repaired. Trust had been broken not just by one person's actions, but by the silence and complicity that allowed them to continue. Some fractures don't heal. They require distance to prevent further damage. That was a hard truth to accept, especially at an age when people expect things to simplify, not grow more complicated. There is an unspoken belief that later life should be about reconciliation, about smoothing edges and letting go. What no one tells you is that sometimes letting go means letting go of people. There were calls from extended family, carefully worded messages, suggestions that perhaps forgiveness would help everyone move on. I listened politely, but I did not agree. Forgiveness, I came to understand, is not a shortcut to peace. It is a choice that can only be made when accountability exists. Silence should never be mistaken for absolution. I did not seek revenge. I did not celebrate what had happened. I did not take pleasure in consequences. But I refused to minimize the harm that had been done simply to make others more comfortable. Dignity matters more than comfort. In the weeks that followed, routines returned slowly altered, but intact. My wife and I adjusted to a quieter life, one that felt smaller, but more honest. Conversations were slower now, more deliberate. We spoke openly about fears we had once dismissed and assumptions we no longer trusted. There was loss in that honesty, but also strength. I spent time reflecting on who I was without the roles I had relied on for so long. Not a surgeon, not the unquestioned patriarch of a family, just a man who had chosen truth when silence no longer protected what mattered. That choice came with a cost. Some relationships could not be saved. Some illusions could not be restored. But there was clarity in knowing I had not compromised my integrity to preserve appearances. I thought often about the expectation that age should make us softer, more willing to overlook harm for the sake of peace. What I learned instead was that age sharpens certain truths. It strips away the desire to pretend. I no longer needed to be liked. I needed to be whole. Standing in the quiet of our home one evening, I realized that while I had lost a version of my family, I had not lost myself. In fact, I understood myself better than I had in years. The fear that had once hovered over me had been replaced by something steadier, acceptance, not resignation. Acceptance. I accepted that some people would never fully understand my choices. I accepted that protecting myself had also meant protecting my wife in ways she would always struggle with. I accepted that justice does not guarantee emotional closure. What it does offer is dignity. As the days turned into weeks, I felt a sense of stability return. Not the naive stability I once believed in, but one built on awareness, on boundaries, on the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can face uncomfortable truths without collapsing. The family I could not save still existed somewhere fractured and distant. I mourned it without trying to resurrect it. Mourning, I discovered, is not the same as regret. Regret suggests a better choice was available. There wasn't. What remained was not what I had planned for the later years of my life. But it was real, and it was mine. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. What remained after everything else fell away was quieter than I expected. The house didn't feel empty, just honest. Mornings still arrived the same way they always had, light spilling across the kitchen table, the familiar sound of the coffee maker filling the silence. But something inside me had shifted. I no longer woke up bracing for uncertainty. The questions that once circled my thoughts endlessly had settled into something clearer, steadier. Peace, I learned, isn't the absence of conflict. It's the absence of denial. At 70, people assume strength looks a certain way. They imagine it fading with time, replaced by dependence or fear. What I discovered instead was that strength had simply changed its shape. It no longer lived in endurance or authority. It lived in judgment, in restraint, in knowing when to speak and when silence carries more power. I had been underestimated because of my age. That was their mistake. Age had given me patience they didn't recognize and perspective they couldn't replicate. It had taught me that rushing rarely leads to truth, and that dignity is worth protecting even when it costs you comfort. The very thing they believed made me vulnerable was what allowed me to see the situation clearly. My marriage survived not because it was untouched, but because it was real. My wife and I talked more openly in the weeks that followed than we had in years. Not out of crisis, but out of respect for what we had almost lost. Healing wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It looked like long conversations without urgency, shared glances that acknowledged pain without reopening it, and the slow rebuilding of trust through transparency rather than reassurance. She told me there were moments she wished she had known sooner. I told her there were moments I wished I had been brave enough to tell her everything. Both of those truths existed at the same time, and neither of them erased the other. Love doesn't undo mistakes. It grows around them. What surprised me most was how little anger I carried. I didn't replay the night endlessly. I didn't fantasize about punishment or humiliation. I didn't need to. What mattered had already been preserved. My autonomy, my marriage, my sense of self. Those things are not restored by revenge. They are protected by clarity. I understood then that justice doesn't always announce itself with satisfaction. Sometimes it arrives quietly, leaving you with space to breathe again. Sometimes it doesn't feel triumphant at all. It just feels final. There was a lesson in all of this that I hadn't learned in medical school or in decades of professional life. Danger doesn't always arrive as force. Sometimes it comes as concern, as help offered too eagerly, as familiarity used as leverage. The people who do the most damage are often the ones who believe they're entitled to decide what's best for you. If there's one thing I would say to anyone listening who feels a quiet unease in their own life, it's this. Pay attention to how people speak about you, especially when you're not included in the conversation. Notice when questions turn into conclusions, when help turns into control. Trust your instincts, but verify them. Silence can be wisdom, but only when it's paired with preparation. Age does not make you irrelevant. It makes you experienced. Experience is invisible power. It's the ability to recognize patterns before they become crises. It's knowing that not every battle needs to be fought loudly to be won decisively. And it's understanding that dignity is not something others grant you. It's something you defend. I no longer measure my days by what I've lost. I measure them by what I've protected. A peaceful home, an honest marriage, a clear mind. Those are not small victories. They are everything. The family I once imagined growing old alongside looks different now. Smaller, more distant. That grief doesn't vanish, but it no longer defines me. Some chapters close without apology. Some doors stay shut because opening them again would invite the same harm. That's not bitterness. That's wisdom. As I sit here now telling this story, I don't feel like a man who escaped something. I feel like a man who finally understood the value of standing still and letting the truth walk into the light on its own. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of something you've felt but never quite put into words, I'd like to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you would have done in my place, or what signs you wish you had trusted sooner in your own life. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet strength that comes with age, consider staying with this channel. Subscribe and join a community that understands that the most powerful transformations often happen without shouting. Sometimes the strongest response is calm. Sometimes the most decisive move is patience. And sometimes the tables turn not because you pushed them, but because you waited long enough for the truth to do the work for you. Thank you for listening.